Imagine this: a glittering banquet hall filled with gold, jewels, and the laughter of kings and queens. Goblets of silver catch the light of hundreds of candles, and behind every smile may lurk betrayal. Because in the world of European nobility, poison was not only a weapon, it was an art. Welcome, my friend, to History 1. If you enjoy these mysterious tales of hidden secrets and royal intrigues, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next story. Tonight, we begin with the poisoned cup, the legends of assassinations at royal banquets. They say history is written by the victors, but the shadows of history are often written in whispers, secrets, betrayals, and cups filled not with wine, but with death. Banquets were the stage where power was displayed. Riches, alliances, and bloodlines were celebrated at tables heavy with roasted meats, exotic fruits, and overflowing goblets. Yet these same feasts were also traps, where a sip too careless or a bite too trusting could bring the end of kings and the fall of empires. One such story begins in Renaissance Italy, the land of the Medici. Florence, a city of power, art, and treachery. The Medici family ruled not only with gold, but with shadows. Lorenzo de' Medici knew well that enemies were everywhere, and it is said that his table was always watched by tasters, servants forced to take the first sip of wine before the Lord himself. Still, legends persist that many noble rivals never left a Medici banquet alive. Poison, slipped into goblets of sweetened wine, was the weapon of choice. It killed quietly, leaving no sword to blame, no assassin to catch. But the Medici were not alone. Across Europe, from the courts of France to the palaces of England, the poisoned cup became a silent executioner. It was a tool of those who could not risk open war, but who hungered for power nonetheless. At Versailles, whispers spread that even the Sun King, Louis XIV, had faced plots against his life through food and drink. The infamous affair of the poisons in the late 17th century revealed a web of alchemists, poisoners, and nobles desperate to climb the ladder of power, some willing to slip a drop of death into a royal chalice. And then there is the chilling tale of Ivan the Terrible of Russia, whose paranoia at banquets was legendary. He believed every goblet was poisoned, every plate cursed. He trusted no one, and with good reason, because poison was the perfect weapon for those too cowardly to strike with steel. But perhaps the most haunting stories come not from the obvious tyrants, but from those who thought themselves untouchable. Those who laughed, toasted, and raised their cups, unaware that the very wine they swallowed carried their last breath. The banquet table was both theater and battlefield. Nobles raised their goblets to friendship and loyalty, yet behind those gestures, betrayal often brewed. To kill with a blade was crude. To kill with poison at a feast was elegant, silent, mysterious, and almost poetic. As we begin this journey into the legends of the poisoned cup, remember this: the past was never as clean as the history books claim. Behind the grand halls, behind the glitter of crowns, there were always shadows, and sometimes those shadows swirled in the wine. In the grand halls of Europe, where chandeliers glittered like constellations and silver goblets clinked in toasts of unity, poison became the most refined of weapons. A dagger could be traced, a blade could be blamed. But poison dissolved into silence. It left behind no assassin to punish, only a mystery to whisper about for centuries. Let us begin in France, where perhaps the most infamous web of poisonings shook not only the nobility, but the very throne itself. This was the affair of the poisons, a scandal that spread like wildfire through the court of Louis XIV. At Versailles, appearances were everything. Nobles jostled for favor, their lives orbiting the king like planets around the sun. Yet beneath the perfumes and powdered wigs lay desperation, envy, and ambition that would stop at nothing. Whispers spoke of secret gatherings where noblewomen purchased potions, powders, and deadly concoctions from fortune-tellers and so-called alchemists. Some sought love philters to ensnare a lover. Others sought remedies for infertility. But many, it is said, came seeking poison. The target? Husbands who stood in the way of inheritance. Rivals who blocked paths to influence. And, most dangerously, the king himself. Testimonies claimed that noble hands plotted to slip poison into Louis's food to end the reign of the Sun King with one carefully prepared meal. Though Louis lived, the scandal revealed that his glittering court was a nest of serpents. Some nobles were tried and executed, others disappeared into prison walls. Yet the whispers never ceased. How many had already fallen victim, their deaths passed off as illness, their enemies quietly celebrating at another feast. But France was not alone. In Italy, the art of poison reached heights that seemed almost scientific. The Borgia family, whose name still carries a shadow of infamy, was rumored to have perfected the use of poison at banquets. Cesare Borgia and his sister, the beautiful Lucrezia, were said to host feasts where enemies never left alive. The tale goes that their cups were laced with a subtle venom, often hidden in wine that masked the taste. To the world, the Borgias were patrons of the arts and masters of politics. To their enemies, they were the embodiment of death served in a goblet. Was it true? Historians debate. Some say Lucrezia was slandered by rivals, painted as a femme fatale, when in truth, she was a pawn of politics. But the legend persists, because in the darkened corners of history, truth often mingles with fear, and fear itself becomes legend. In England, too, the poisoned cup played its part. During the turbulent reigns of the Tudors, banquets were not merely social gatherings, but acts of survival. King Henry VIII himself lived in constant fear of poison. His kitchens employed tasters who would sample every dish before it touched the royal lips. One legend claims that Catherine de Valois, centuries before, had already died under suspicious circumstances, her death rumored to have come from a poisoned chalice meant for another. The English court, like all of Europe, understood the silent language of poison. And yet, the poisoned cup was not always about ambition or revenge. Sometimes it was about desperation. Imagine a noblewoman trapped in a loveless marriage, her fortune controlled by a cruel husband. Divorce was impossible, freedom unthinkable. To such a woman, a vial of poison offered not just escape, but power. At a banquet, a single drop in a husband's wine could change her fate forever. Banquets, then, were not only celebrations, but stages where fate itself could be rewritten. Every raised goblet carried with it a question. Was it filled with friendship or with death? And as candles flickered on golden plates, as violins played in the background, one thought haunted every noble mind. Trust no one. The fear of poison reshaped royal banquets across Europe. What began as glittering gatherings of trust and kinship turned into tense performances of suspicion. Behind every smile was calculation, and behind every toast, unease. The Venetians were perhaps the most secretive masters of this art. Venice, a republic built on wealth and secrecy, thrived on intrigue. The Council of Ten, that shadowy governing body, was rumored to employ poison as a political tool. Enemies of the state sometimes vanished not by blade or public trial, but by slow, untraceable death. Feasts in Venetian palaces became whispered theaters of control, where the goblet in your hand might decide your fate. Travel now to the Holy Roman Empire, where the Habsburgs sat upon their sprawling dominions. The Habsburg court, filled with grandeur and endless banquets, was equally haunted by the poisoned cup. Their empire, stitched together by marriages more than by swords, was vulnerable to betrayal at the table. Alliances sealed by wine could also be broken by it. One story tells of an ambitious noble who sought to remove a rival through poison, only to mistakenly sip from the wrong cup himself. His sudden collapse during a banquet became a grim lesson. In a world of shadows, death often finds the one who sends it. But no court embraced paranoia quite like that of Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. In Muscovy, fear reigned supreme. Ivan trusted no banquet, no servant, no dish. He surrounded himself with oprichniki, his loyal guards, who were said to sample and bless every morsel. Yet even with these precautions, rumors claimed that some of his closest advisors met their ends through poisoned wine, their deaths disguised as natural illness. Ivan himself grew so suspicious that he avoided shared meals altogether, eating only food prepared in secret chambers. His distrust became legend, shaping Russian history as much as his cruelty. Yet the poisoned cup was not merely a weapon of kings, it was also a weapon used against them. In Scotland, whispers surrounded the death of Lord Darnley, the husband of Mary, Queen of Scots. While he ultimately died in an explosion, there were tales that poison had first been attempted. Mary herself would later be accused of plots involving poison, her reputation darkened not only by politics, but by the ever-present suspicion that surrounded queens in an age where one sip could end a dynasty. The strangeness of poison lies in its intimacy. A sword can be swung from a distance, a dagger can be plunged in the dark, but poison requires closeness. It must be slipped into a cup offered with trust, or poured into a feast prepared for honored guests. It is betrayal, distilled into liquid form, consumed willingly by its victim. Perhaps this is why tales of poison linger longer than tales of battles. Wars are written in chronicles, but a poisoned cup is written in whispers, rumors, and legends. A king dying in combat is noble. A king collapsing at a banquet, choking on a sip of wine, is scandalous. It hints that power itself is fragile, that even in the safest of places, death can slip silently into the cup. And still, the question remains, how many deaths recorded as fevers or sudden illness were in truth the work of poison? Historians can only speculate, but the nobles of Europe never doubted. They hired tasters, tested their food with silver spoons, and turned mealtimes into rituals of survival. For behind every banquet, behind every feast, was the unspoken knowledge: the next sip could be the last. In the courts of Europe, fear turned dining into a deadly game of theater. Food was not merely nourishment, it was a test of loyalty. Every servant in the kitchen, every steward pouring wine, every hand that touched the plate carried the power of life or death, and the nobles knew it. In Spain, where the Habsburg kings ruled vast lands stretching from Europe to the New World, paranoia about poison was deeply woven into courtly life. The Spanish court was one of the most rigid and ceremonious in Europe, where every action was governed by protocol. But beneath the layers of etiquette and ritual lurked an atmosphere of quiet dread. Royal kitchens were guarded like fortresses. Silver goblets and cutlery were said to change color if touched by certain poisons, a belief that, while largely superstition, became common practice in royal households. Servants and tasters were forced to risk their lives before their masters ever lifted a fork. Yet history shows that not all precautions worked. King Charles II of Spain, known as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, suffered from mysterious illnesses throughout his life. His enemies whispered that he was cursed, the result of inbreeding that had weakened the Habsburg line. But others believed darker. Forces were at play, that poison was slowly destroying him from within. Was it true? No one can say for certain. But in the dim halls of the Escorial, where he wasted away, the shadow of poison lingered. Italy remained the crucible of poisonous legend. The Renaissance had brought not only art and philosophy, but also a fascination with alchemy and secret substances. Apothecaries, some loyal, some treacherous, prepared powders and tinctures that could be slipped into wine without trace. One of the most infamous was aqua tofana, a colorless, tasteless poison said to kill slowly and gracefully, leaving victims looking as if they had died of natural causes. Its use spread among noblewomen in Naples and Rome, many of whom longed to free themselves from cruel or unwanted marriages. At banquets, a few drops in a husband's goblet could turn a toast to happiness into a death sentence. The beauty of aqua tofana was also its terror. Because it left little sign of foul play, suspicion hung in the air like incense. How many noblemen fell to it? How many deaths were disguised as accidents of fate? No one knew, and that uncertainty was what made it powerful. Further north, in the German principalities, rival dukes and electors often feuded not only with armies, but also across dining tables. At wedding feasts, those supposed symbols of union, rumors of poisoned chalices haunted the halls. To wed into power was to risk death at the very celebration of alliance. Chroniclers speak of sudden deaths, of brides left widows within hours of their vows, their husbands collapsing before the last course was served. Were these tragedies of fate or carefully calculated assassinations? But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these stories is how normalized the fear became. In some courts, it was tradition that the monarch would eat only from plates prepared in their private chambers. Others developed elaborate rituals of testing where multiple tasters sampled every dish in front of all the guests, a performance designed to reassure, but which only underscored the danger. Because poison was not just about death, it was about power, about fear, about control. The mere suspicion that a banquet could be fatal gave rulers leverage over their enemies. To dine with a king was to accept the possibility of death. To drink from a royal cup was to gamble with fate. And so, across Europe, feasts glittered brighter, music played louder, and laughter rang sharper. But always, beneath it all, there was the unspoken terror of the poisoned cup. The deeper we wander into these stories, the clearer it becomes. The banquet was never truly a place of safety. It was a theater of masks, where trust was a costume and loyalty could vanish with a single sip. Take, for example, the banquet halls of Burgundy in the 15th century. The dukes of Burgundy were among the most powerful nobles in Europe, richer than kings, presiding over feasts of almost unimaginable grandeur. Their tables groaned under the weight of roasted peacocks, gilded pies, and wines imported from every corner of their dominions. But within these feasts, there were whispers of betrayal. Chroniclers speak of a gathering where one of the duke's close advisors collapsed suddenly, his face turning pale as he clutched his chest. The official record claims a sudden apoplexy. Yet rumors in the court suggested a poisoned chalice had silenced him, a warning to others who might plot treachery. Move forward to the courts of the Stuarts in England and Scotland. Here, poison wove itself into political legend. The death of James I of Scotland in 1437 involved daggers, but whispers claimed that his enemies had first tried to poison him at a feast, only resorting to blades when the attempt failed. Later, suspicions haunted the death of Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, the ill-fated husband of Mary, Queen of Scots. His mysterious illness before his violent end led many to believe poison was the opening act of a larger plot. In the Scottish imagination, the poisoned cup became inseparable from the theater of power. But the most notorious legends belong once more to Italy. The Borgia family remains the name most entwined with poison, though history has blurred fact and slander. Tales tell of hollow rings used to sprinkle venom into a goblet, of golden cups filled with death disguised as sweet wine. Banquets hosted by Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, were said to be feasts where enemies could vanish forever. Did Cesare and Lucrezia truly use poison to eliminate rivals? Or were they victims of propaganda, painted as monsters by their enemies? The truth may never be known, but the legend has endured for centuries precisely because it captures the essence of noble fear, that even in the glow of celebration, death might sit beside you, waiting to be swallowed. And then there is the case of René of Anjou, a lesser-known figure yet tied to one of the darkest banquet rumors of the 15th century. Chronicles suggest that a political rival of his was invited to dine, only to fall gravely ill after the feast. The man's death was attributed to poison, and though René himself was never proven guilty, the suspicion clung to his reputation. In an age where alliances shifted like sand, poison became not just a weapon, but a stigma, a way to tarnish the name of a rival, even without proof. One must remember, medieval and Renaissance medicine could not distinguish poison from disease. A sudden fever, convulsions, or wasting illness might just as easily be attributed to bad humors or divine punishment as to a drop slipped into a goblet. This ignorance gave poisoners the perfect cover. The victim's body became the ultimate disguise, its collapse explained away by doctors, while the true assassin raised his glass in victory. The symbolism of the poisoned cup is as chilling as its reality. A banquet is a place of supposed trust, of sharing bread and wine as signs of fellowship. 2. Poison that cup was not just murder. It was the destruction of sacred bonds. It turned communion into betrayal and friendship into a trap. That is why these stories have never died. They are not only about who lived or who perished. They are about the fragility of power, the illusion of safety, and the truth that even amidst music, laughter, and the glow of candles, death can be waiting quietly at the bottom of the glass. By the 17th century, the poisoned cup had become more than a rumor. It was a weapon so feared that entire courts built elaborate systems to defend against it. And yet, the more precautions they invented, the more ingenious the poisoners became. Consider the French court again during the turbulent reign of Louis XIII. His chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, was a man who understood power not only in politics, but in survival. Richelieu was constantly threatened by conspiracies, and his enemies were said to prefer poison over the sword. He was reported to have carried antidotes with him at all times and kept his food and drink under constant watch. Some accounts even suggest he tested his wine with unicorn horns, objects believed in medieval superstition to detect poison. Of course, no such power existed, but in a world filled with suspicion, even superstition was a shield. And yet, even the greatest precautions could fail. In the glittering salons of Paris, the affair of the poisons continued to haunt the nobility. Imagine the scene: nobles seated at a feast, a toast raised to the king, the clink of goblets ringing through the air, and behind it all, the quiet knowledge that someone in the room might be plotting to lace that very drink. The scandal revealed how easily poison slipped through the cracks of ceremony. A drop hidden in a golden cup as easily as in a humble glass. But France was not alone in its fear. Across the Channel, the English court trembled at similar dangers. Queen Elizabeth I herself was so wary of poison that she employed a special team known as the Yeomen of the Mouth, whose sole duty was to guard her meals. Every dish was tasted, every goblet inspected. She ate with rituals of paranoia, yet for good reason. Rumors swirled that Catholic conspirators sought to end her life with poison, slipping death into her wine during one of her many public progresses. The Virgin Queen survived, but her lifelong caution at the table was a testament to how real the threat was. Italy, meanwhile, remained a crucible of dark legend. The whispered tales of aqua tofana grew ever more chilling. Unlike quick poisons, aqua tofana killed slowly, allowing victims to waste away in what seemed like natural illness. This made it particularly dangerous in banquets, where a drop in a goblet did not cause immediate suspicion. The victim could leave the feast unharmed, only to grow weaker day by day, his decline blamed on fate rather than treachery. For noblewomen trapped in marriages without escape, this poison became infamous as the widow's friend. Courts in Rome and Naples grew so suspicious that even the faintest illness of a powerful man raised whispers of aqua tofana. But the fascination with poison was not only about fear, it was also about control. Poison symbolized a kind of invisible power. A king could command armies, but a single servant with access to his wine cup could undo him. Nobles feared not just their rivals, but their own households, the servants who carried plates, the cooks who stirred pots, the cupbearers who poured wine. To eat and drink was to trust, and in trusting, one risked everything. And so, the banquet became a paradox. On the surface, it was a place of abundance, laughter, music, and light. But beneath that surface, it was a battlefield of nerves, where every swallow could be a gamble. The most glittering nights of European history, the masked balls, the coronation feasts, the wedding banquets, were never free from this shadow. Even now, centuries later, these legends cling to the imagination because they remind us of something eternal. Power is always fragile, and the deadliest threats often wear the friendliest smiles. The banquet, by its very nature, symbolized unity, celebration, and trust. Kings broke bread with their allies, queens toasted with their rivals, and entire dynasties marked their triumphs with feasts. But it was precisely this sacred symbolism that made poison so terrifying. To slip death into a goblet was to desecrate one of the most ancient human rituals, the act of sharing food as a bond of loyalty. One chilling story comes from Renaissance Florence. During a lavish banquet hosted by the powerful Medici family, a rival noble was said to collapse mid-feast, clutching at his throat as his face grew pale. Official records described it as sudden illness, but rumor claimed otherwise, that a rare venom from the East had been mixed into his wine. Whether true or not, the tale spread like wildfire. For years afterward, Florentine nobles raised their cups with forced smiles, never quite sure if the ruby liquid inside was wine or something darker. Meanwhile, in the courts of the German princes, poison became a tool of diplomacy as much as assassination. It is said that during one marriage alliance feast, a young duke died before the night was over, the victim of a fever. The bride, now a widow before her wedding week had passed, returned home in disgrace. Historians debate whether it was disease or treachery, but the effect was the same. The alliance collapsed, and rival factions gained the upper hand. A single cup of poisoned wine had undone months of negotiation, rewriting the politics of an entire region. Russia, too, was a land where poison lurked in every shadow of the banquet hall. The Romanov dynasty, long after Ivan the Terrible, remained wary of poisonings. Tsar Peter the Great himself conducted brutal investigations when courtiers died suspiciously, often ordering autopsies, an unusual practice at the time, because he believed poison was nearly always the culprit. His paranoia was not misplaced. Foreign ambassadors recorded that Russian feasts, though glittering with vodka and wine, were haunted by the ever-present fear that any cup could be a trap. The symbolism of the poisoned cup also seeped into literature and legend. Shakespeare, writing for Elizabethan England, knew his audience well. In Hamlet, the Danish king meets his end by drinking from a poisoned goblet, a scene that would have struck Elizabethan viewers with chilling familiarity. The play was fiction, but the fear it evoked was very real, echoing the constant rumors of poisoned feasts in courts across Europe. To watch a king fall from a poisoned cup on stage was to see reflected the unspoken dread of real life. And yet, not all who poisoned did so out of ambition or vengeance. Some did so out of desperation, as in the case of noblewomen trapped in cruel marriages. For them, the banquet was the perfect setting. Surrounded by music and laughter, they could pour a drop into a husband's drink unnoticed, the crowd itself serving as their camouflage. To others, poison was the only way to level a world where women had little legal power. The goblet became their dagger, the banquet their battlefield. What makes these stories endure is not simply the deaths, but the atmosphere they create. A battlefield is filled with visible danger, but a banquet, bright with candles, filled with laughter, should be safe. To discover betrayal in such a place unsettles something deep within us. It teaches that danger hides not in the shadows of the battlefield, but in the very places where trust is demanded most. And so, every toast at a royal feast carried a silent question. Will this drink celebrate my life or end it? As the centuries passed, the poisoned cup did not disappear. It merely adapted, slipping further into the hidden layers of history. The 18th century, with its Enlightenment ideals and glittering salons, might appear more refined, but refinement did not erase suspicion. In fact, with science advancing, poison became even more feared, for people now believed in substances more subtle, more undetectable, more terrifying than ever before. At the court of Louis XV of France, paranoia lingered from the great scandal of his predecessor's time. The affair of the poisons had burned poison into the very memory of Versailles. The king dined with pageantry, but behind every ritual was fear. Entire rooms were dedicated to the preparation of royal meals, guarded by soldiers. Servants were searched, and food tasters performed their duties with grim resignation. Yet still, whispers remained. A noble's sudden illness, a minister's unexplained death, always raised the same question. Was it disease, or was it poison in the goblet? Elsewhere, in the German lands, poison began to take on a new role, that of political accusation. During heated rivalries between princes, accusing one's enemy of poisoning at a feast became a weapon in itself. It did not matter if it were true. The stain of suspicion was often enough to ruin reputations, break alliances, or justify war. In this way, the poisoned cup became as much a weapon of rumor as of reality. Russia again offers us one of the most dramatic tales. Tsarina Catherine the Great, though secure in her reign, lived surrounded by courtiers whose loyalty was always in question. Banquets at her court dazzled with opulence, but the fear of poison remained constant. Catherine, like Ivan before her, employed tasters and demanded strict rituals around her food. Yet some historians suggest that her rivals, both foreign and domestic, plotted to end her rule by slipping venom into her drink. She survived them all, but the paranoia that surrounded her reign was not unfounded. Her husband, Peter III, died under suspicious circumstances, and though it was officially murder, poison was rumored to have played a part. But perhaps one of the most haunting stories comes from Poland, a kingdom often torn between great powers. In the 17th century, King John III Sobieski, the hero of Vienna who turned back the Ottoman tide, was rumored to have enemies even among those who toasted him. Chronicles tell of a banquet where the king was warned at the last moment not to drink from a certain goblet handed to him with too much eagerness by a guest. Whether true or not, the story spread across Europe, reinforcing the idea that even the savior of Christendom could be undone not on the battlefield, but at a feast. It is striking to think that poison, more than any weapon of war, carried such a unique terror. A sword could be defended against, an enemy army seen on the horizon. But poison came in silence, offered with a smile, passed in the most human of gestures, the sharing of wine. It transformed the banquet hall, supposedly the heart of unity, into a minefield of suspicion. And beyond the politics, beyond the betrayals, there is something profoundly human in these stories. They remind us of our fragility, of how trust itself can be weaponized. To this day, when we hear the phrase "a poisoned cup," it does not simply mean a drink laced with venom. It means a gift that conceals betrayal, a promise that hides destruction, a friendship that masks treachery. That is why these legends endure, not because of the number of kings or dukes who may have died from poison, but because the very image of the poisoned cup speaks to the deepest fear in the human heart, that death may come not from the hand of an enemy, but from the hand of a friend. By the dawn of the 19th century, Europe had changed. Revolutions shook thrones, empires crumbled, and the age of enlightenment gave way to the industrial world. Yet the poisoned cup remained a lingering shadow in the imagination of both rulers and subjects. Even as guillotines and muskets replaced daggers and feasts as tools of power, the quiet terror of poison still clung to royal courts. Take the case of Napoleon Bonaparte. Though not of ancient royal blood, he crowned himself emperor and inherited all the fears of monarchs before him. Napoleon was notorious for his suspicion, and for good reason. His rise had been surrounded by betrayal. He traveled with personal supplies of wine and often refused to drink anything prepared outside his own circle. After his defeat and exile to St. Helena, his death became one of the great historical mysteries. Officially, he died of stomach cancer. But whispers began almost immediately. Was he poisoned? Some claimed arsenic had been slipped into his food or drink over time, a slow death designed to silence him forever. Centuries later, traces of arsenic were indeed found in his hair, though whether from deliberate poisoning or environmental sources remains debated. The legend persists because it fits so neatly into the old tradition that even the mightiest conqueror could be undone by what lay hidden in his cup. In Austria, the old Habsburg dynasty still carried the paranoia of earlier centuries. The Viennese court, known for its music and glittering balls, was no stranger to whispers of poisonings. Emperors and empresses dined in rituals so elaborate that hours passed before the first course even reached the table. But these rituals were not only about grandeur, they were about safety. Every dish was inspected, every goblet guarded. And yet, sudden deaths still occurred. An archduke collapsing after a banquet, a noblewoman struck by a mysterious fever after a wedding feast. Each became fodder for rumor, each a possible echo of the poisoned cup. The British monarchy, too, remained cautious. Centuries after the Tudors, the Hanoverian kings continued the practice of food tasters. George III, plagued by illness and madness, was sometimes thought to be poisoned, his condition blamed on arsenic. In truth, it was more likely a disease of the blood, but the very suspicion reveals how deeply poison was woven into the political imagination. For the British public, reading newspapers filled with intrigue, the idea of a poisoned king seemed not only possible, but almost expected, a continuation of the old legends. But it was not only kings and emperors who feared the poisoned cup. By the 19th century, revolutionaries, anarchists, and secret societies also turned to poison as a tool. Banquets, once symbols of dynastic power, became dangerous for a new reason. They gathered enemies together in one place. To strike at a banquet was to strike at an entire network of power in a single blow. The old weapon of nobles now became the weapon of conspirators. Yet even as science advanced, as doctors learned to detect more toxins, the mystique of the poisoned cup only grew. Writers of the age, novelists like Alexandre Dumas, filled their tales with sinister goblets and banquets of betrayal. The poisoned chalice became less a historical event and more a symbol, a literary motif passed down from the Middle Ages into modern imagination. To drink from a cup in these stories was never just to drink wine. It was to gamble with destiny. So when we look back across the centuries, from the Borgias to Versailles, from the Tudors to Napoleon, what do we see? Not simply a list of victims, but a pattern. That in every age, in every palace, the banquet table was never just a place of joy. It was also a battlefield of trust, where the deadliest strike could come not from a sword, but from the sweetest sip of wine. And that is why the poisoned cup remains one of history's most enduring legends. Even today, when we walk through the ruined castles of Europe, when we admire the faded frescoes of banquet halls or gaze at the long tables of palaces now turned into museums, it is impossible not to imagine the shadows of the past. The laughter of nobles once filled these rooms. The clink of goblets echoed under vaulted ceilings. And yet, how many of those goblets carried not joy, but death? The poisoned cup was not just a weapon of convenience. It was a reflection of human nature. It thrived in places where ambition outweighed loyalty, where the hunger for power surpassed the sanctity of trust. To poison a man at a banquet was not merely to kill him. It was to humiliate him, to strip him of dignity in the very place he should have been most secure. That is why the legends strike us so deeply. Take again the example of the Borgia family, endlessly vilified in rumor. Whether or not Lucretia ever poured venom into a chalice, the very fact that her name endures in connection with poison shows how the banquet became a stage of both history and myth. In her, the world saw the archetype of deadly beauty, the hostess whose smile masked death. Whether real or fabricated, the tale captured the imagination of Europe because it embodied the deepest fear of the age, betrayal hidden behind elegance. Or think of the affair of the poisons in France, which exposed not only crimes, but a culture of paranoia. At Versailles, people whispered that even the queen herself could not trust her goblet. The scandal shook the court because it showed that poison was not confined to dark alleys or secret assassins. It lived at the very heart of nobility. The banquet, which should have symbolized order, was revealed as chaos. The image of the poisoned cup has also survived because it is profoundly symbolic. In Christianity, the chalice is sacred, the vessel of communion, of life and unity. To corrupt that image with poison was to corrupt not only the body, but the soul. It is no wonder that Shakespeare and his contemporaries used poisoned goblets to signify ultimate betrayal. When Hamlet's mother drinks from the poisoned cup, the audience feels not just her death, but the death of trust itself. And so, the motif endured into folklore and legend. In taverns and villages across Europe, stories spread of noblemen who fell dead at their wedding feasts, of queens who plotted with apothecaries, of dukes who invited guests to drink from cups already prepared with death. Many of these stories cannot be proven, but proof was never the point. The very possibility was enough to make them powerful. Imagine yourself, a guest at such a banquet. The hall glows with candlelight, minstrels play softly in the corner, and the air smells of roasted meats and spiced wine. A servant places a goblet in your hand, golden and shimmering. Across the table, your rival raises his own cup, smiling with practiced grace. The king lifts his chalice, calling for a toast. And in that moment, as all raise their glasses, you hesitate, because in your mind comes the thought that haunted every noble in Europe for centuries. What if this drink is my last? That hesitation, that flicker of doubt, is the true legacy of the poisoned cup. It was not only the deaths it caused, but the fear it left behind. Fear that trust could be broken. Fear that loyalty was only a mask. Fear that the sweetest wine might carry the bitterest fate. And so, across centuries, across kingdoms, the legend remained. Because long after crowns tarnish and palaces crumble, the fear of betrayal, silent, invisible, waiting at the bottom of the glass, still speaks to us. The poisoned cup is more than just a tale of death. It is a mirror into the human soul. To understand why it haunts history, we must understand what it meant to those who lived beneath crowns, in palaces heavy with intrigue. For the monarch, the banquet was theater. Every toast, every course, every glittering goblet was part of a performance meant to display wealth, power, and control. Yet beneath the music and laughter lay a dangerous truth. The closer one was to the throne, the closer one was to danger. Every guest at the king's table was both ally and rival. Every sip of wine was a gamble. The nobles understood this. It is why they trained themselves to read faces, to watch hands, to study the flicker of an eye as closely as they studied a treaty. The banquet was not simply dining. It was war conducted with lace and silverware. And in this war, poison was the perfect weapon. Quiet, discreet, and devastating. Consider the psychology. A blade requires confrontation, a duel demands skill, but poison slips past both courage and honor. It is an assassin's art, one that thrives on secrecy. To fall by poison was to admit you had been deceived, that you had trusted when you should not have. It was, in many ways, the most humiliating of deaths. That is why it fascinated Europe. The chroniclers of the Middle Ages, the gossip of the Renaissance, the pamphleteers of the Enlightenment, they all repeated these tales, not simply because men died, but because of what the deaths revealed about power. Poisoned banquets reminded the world that beneath the silks and crowns, monarchs were as fragile as anyone else. The image of the poisoned cup endured even in literature, because it resonated beyond history. It became a symbol in fairy tales, the wicked queen offering a goblet, the cursed drink at a royal feast. It appeared in folklore as a warning, a way to teach suspicion of appearances. It was not just about kings, it was about all of us, about the danger of trust misplaced. And yet, ironically, the very fear of poison often strengthened power. Monarchs who survived such dangers were seen as chosen, protected by divine will. If a king drank freely and lived, his people whispered that fate favored him. If he refused a drink, he appeared wise and cautious. Thus, even the threat of poison was woven into the ritual of monarchy. As centuries passed, the actual use of poison may have declined, but its shadow remained. Even into the Victorian era, when science sought to banish superstition, the stories of poisoned banquets still captivated readers. They reminded a changing world of the darker, more secretive past. And in truth, such fears never vanish completely. Even today, when presidents and monarchs dine, food tasters and security remain part of the unseen ritual. The old legend still shapes the present. So, when we speak of the poisoned cup, we are not merely recounting a list of deaths. We are exploring a myth that bound together fear, power, and betrayal. We are uncovering the secret heartbeat of royal Europe, where the brightest feasts were lit by shadows and where every toast might be a farewell. The poisoned cup is not just history, it is human nature distilled into a single sip.